Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about regions of British colonies, and today we are talking about the transatlantic trade. So, if you are ready, let's begin. The first thing to talk about is the Atlantic economy. And the Atlantic economy during this time period is going to be focused on trade, and specifically trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, where goods are exchanged, but also people are exchanged, like enslaved Africans and natives. And they enslaved Africans are taken on a route called the Middle Passage, which is the route from Africa to the Americas. It was a horrifying route. Many slaves aboard the ships did not survive the journey, and this was the first part of their step onto slavery in the Americas. And so, again, trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, it was goods, but it was also people that were exchanged. Now, the colonies, and focusing on the colonies here, right? So, what did they focus on in terms of the Atlantic economy? Well, they wanted to acquire, produce, and export commodities that were valued in Europe, meaning they were focused on how can we make money by selling things to Europe. And the main things they're going to do this with is fur. We've talked about a lot about the fur trade in previous lessons. Tobacco, especially in the Chesapeake colonies, tobacco is very popular to grow there. And then sugar is worth a lot of money in Europe at this time, and sugar is grown in the South and in the West Indies. They're also focused on getting new sources of labor. We're going to see an increase in the slave trade after Bacon's rebellion, and we're going to see slavery replace indentured servitude and Native American labor. The next thing to talk about is the impact of trade in the Atlantic economy on Native communities. And this should be a little bit of review for you. Okay. So, contact and trade with Europeans impacted Native communities in a number of ways. We've already talked about guns and horses and how this kind of transformed warfare, but also transformed the way of life for some Native American groups. There was a lot of cultural changes, like the Spanish often tried to assimilate. They had intermarriage with the natives, right? They developed that caste system that we talked about last unit. But there's also the enslavement of Native peoples. Again, we've talked about that previously. In terms of economic changes or land changes, Native American groups are going to lose a lot of their land to European plantations in America. Right, as Europeans move in, they are taking this land from the Native American groups. And then lastly, demographically, diseases are going to absolutely decimate Native populations. And so this is another example of the impact of the contact and trade with Europeans that is felt by the Native communities. So this should be quick. That should have been a quick review for you. All right, the last thing to talk about today is European and Native American interactions and how did they interact when they were having this contact. Okay, so their interactions fostered accommodation or conflict. So, kind of depending on the group or the situation, sometimes there was accommodation, sometimes things they were getting along better, and sometimes there was conflict. One example of this you kind of use is like Spain versus Britain. Now, in Spain, there was conflict with Native American groups, as we learned about before, but there were also times where they were trying to accommodate and be more accepting of Native American societies. And we talked about their caste system and the idea of intermarriage. Okay. So there's this one event called the Pueblo Revolt, which we're going to get into actually more next lesson. But just to quickly mention it here, it's a revolt against Spain by the Pueblo. And after the revolt, Spain actually becomes more accommodating to the Pueblo and actually lets the Pueblo have more freedoms and more rights. So that's one example of an interaction that fosters accommodation. And Britain's going to be your best example of European and Native American interactions that focus on conflict. The British colonies are often conflicting over land. And one example of this would be Metacoms or King Philip's War. And again, we're going to go into both of those more next time, but I just wanted to mention them here. So, as you're thinking about how did they interact. Also, important to know that Native tribes allied with Europeans against other Native groups. And sometimes Native tribes ally with each other against Europeans, right? We've talked about this idea before. It's not like it was just Europeans versus Native Americans. There was a complex dynamic going on. And the best example I have for you here is the Pequot War from 1636, where colonists from Massachusetts and Connecticut allied with the Narragansett tribe against the Pequot tribe. And this actually virtually eliminated the Pequot tribe, and many Pequots were killed or sold into slavery. And it was a huge example of how sometimes tribes would ally with colonists as a way that they thought that they would get the most out of it, right? The Narragansett had been warring with the Pequot, and so they thought allying with the colonists would allow them to gain power. And so that is, again, an example of how native tribes sometimes ally with Europeans to fight against native groups. Okay, so that is it for our notes on the transatlantic trade. Make sure you're able to answer these big idea questions. Number one, describe the impact of the transatlantic trade on Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Number two, describe the impact of the transatlantic trade on natives. That one should be locked down for you. That one should be review. And number three, describe the interactions between Europeans and natives. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.